Hello, and welcome to the landscape of concussion in Iowa, a changing landscape. My name is Jeffrey Lauer. I serve as Executive Director of the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa, and I'm pleased that the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa, as well as the Iowa Concussion Consortium, is able to sponsor this webinar. The landscape in Iowa has been stable with concussion legislation since 2008. However, this last legislative session that ended in 2018 has some marked changes, and we'll cover that today. My background, just briefly, is about 25 years in the field of brain injury services, supports, family and community-based service supports in Iowa and nationwide. Served as the regional and then a national director of state affairs for the Brain Injury Association of America for a decade before taking the position as exec at the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa about a decade ago. So what's the story here? We're going to go through a couple of components of brain injury, a teeny amount of BI 101 and concussion 101, and then talk about what's changed with the law in Iowa. So the human brain sits up inside of our heads. Most of us know that. Most of you know that. It controls arguably almost every dimension of our lives, our motor abilities, our cognitive abilities, how we react to other people, whether we're angry or we react sadly, and many soft skills, the frontal lobes particularly, which are frankly most vulnerable to a traumatic brain injury, soft skills that let us know how far to sit away from each other in a public place versus how far to sit away from family and friends. Many soft skills that we just don't learn by playbooks. Another good example is if you've ever been into a classroom for a semester of class, the first chair we typically sit in is the chair or area of the room that we'll return to day after day, week after week. We're territorial creatures, and if somebody's taken your, I'm doing air quotes, your chair, or if you take somebody else's chair, there's an emotional reaction. Our brains control a great deal of unsaid and unknown to us, essential navigation skills. The brain takes up 2% of our body weight, but it's an energy hog in that it uses 20% of the body's energy. And that's significant because after any level of brain injury or concussion for that matter, there is a marked decline in the brain's ability to utilize energy. So there is a very typical response after mild to severe brain injury of neurofatigue. And that's not just your brain's tired, although it is, that it comes out in a range of behavioral manifestations. But that's covered in another webinar and in some materials that we'll point you to over the course of this webinar. You know, your brain is often referred to as a food group, Jello. If you had the opportunity to put your finger in it, it would have about the resilience of Jello. I hope you don't have that opportunity. And it floats in the human skull in a bath of cerebral spinal fluid. So it's got a liquid shock absorbing system that's evolved over millennia, millions of years, to be able to protect this fragile organ from the kinds of speeds that we've faced as a race, as a species, for that period of time. And those speeds are nowhere as quick, and the forces were nowhere as quick for the majority of our history as they are in the last 200 years. What I mean is that the skull is a tremendously effective helmet for our brain. It protects us if we fall in general. It protects us if we're walking fast or running fast and have a quick deceleration. But it is not and never was able to protect us from the kinds of forces, of collision forces, of traumatic forces from being inside a box that has an internal combustion engine and shoots us down the road at, say, 55 miles an hour, passing within 6 feet on a good day of another car flying at us at the same speed, so a combined speed of over 100 miles an hour. You know, the skull and the brain just have not yet adapted to that. We don't have giant thick heads yet. So one of the other pieces about the brain floating inside the skull oops, I'm going to back up, is that it is an impossibility to protect the brain from sloshing back and forth and hitting into the front of the skull and bouncing back, for example, on the back of the skull, or for twisting and rotating. It's impossible to protect that by putting a helmet or a headband or a mouth guard in. Those may reduce some of the physical force, the feeling of impact, and they're really good at protecting from head injury, scalp, facial injuries. Helmets are great for that, but we've not got a system, and it's hard to conceive of a system that would be able to protect us from being able to have our brains not slosh back and forth during rapid acceleration or deceleration. The stats for concussion in school-age children in Iowa are the same as across the country. They range from 2% to 5% per year for concussion of school-age children in Iowa, 2% to 5%. In Iowa, in 2016, there were more than 500,000 public and private school students. So when we do the math, that translates into between 10,000 and 26,000 youth concussions each year in Iowa. That's a lot of kids with concussion. This is not it's not a small scale issue, which is one of the reasons that the legislature took some action this year. So where do concussions, particularly in athletics, which is what Iowa's concussion law ties into, where do concussions typically happen in athletics? Well, a concussion can happen anywhere. Let's not ever think that we need to attack any one sport. Football happens to have the rank of number one, so it often does have the visibility for the highest rank in terms of concussions for hours spent playing football. But boys ice hockey, boys lacrosse, girls soccer particularly, all the way down, as well as wrestling, as well as mixed martial arts, as well as boxing. There are specific sports that are very, well, they're higher risk for concussion. And so we tend to put attention on those places because they're more visible. So what is a TBI? A traumatic brain injury can be caused by a bump, a blow, or a jolt to the head or the body that causes the brain to move either quickly back and forth against or to rotate inside the skull. And a loss of consciousness, getting knocked out, getting your bell rung so hard your lights go out, however you want to talk about it. A loss of consciousness is not necessary for diagnosis of a concussion. There is some real specific information that's been coming out of an international consensus conference that's been held now 5 times. It's held every 5 years to review by an august body of healthcare professionals, epidemiologists, physicians, rehabilitation specialists on what have we learned over the last 5 years regarding SRC, sports-related concussion. The last concussion conference was held in Berlin recently, about a couple of years ago, and the news is out that SRC, or sports-related concussion, can be caused, as I said in the previous slide, by a direct blow or by a blow elsewhere on the body. So you can be undercut on the field of any field, a soccer field, a frisbee field, a football field, and an impact to your legs can travel up your spine and can potentially cause a concussion. Sorry. I got a crazy mouse. So sports-related concussion typically results in the rapid onset of short-lived impairment. However, and that's good. It's rapid onset of short-lived impairment. Let's just be clear: 80% of youth with brain injury will have a positive recovery within 3 to 5 weeks. However, in some cases, the signs and symptoms and the behaviors of brain injury, of concussion, evolve over minutes to hours. And therefore, it behooves us as healthcare professionals, as coaches, as school nurses, as teachers, as parents, to keep in mind that just because a kid who may have taken a blow in any setting may look fine now, best to check back a little bit later or to kind of keep an eye to see if symptoms emerge over time. 2 other components of the sports a related concussion statement from the last conference are that concussions are not typically able to be seen on standard neuroimaging. You can't x-ray them. They don't show up on CT scans. They don't show up on MRI scans. They result in neurological and pathological changes, but it's the clinical signs and symptoms. It's what we can see and discern and communicate and hear from a youth athlete or from anybody who's had a mild brain injury. That's the standard of being able to discern what do we think's going on. And I'll say this again, there's the caveat that just makes sense is if there's any doubt that a youth has had a concussion, when in doubt, sit them out. When in doubt, sit them out. So good news here. The resolution of the clinical and cognitive features of concussion typically follow a sequential course. They're very commonly following the same course for most students. However, in some cases, symptoms may be prolonged, and those symptoms are as different as there are people. In the brain injury business, we often say that if you know one person with a brain injury, you know one person with a brain injury. With concussion, there are some typical features of concussion that do follow a sequential course, the short-term component of brain injury. But for long-term, again, that 20% of kids who may not recover as quickly, symptoms will be prolonged, and they'll be somewhat more unique based on many factors for a human being, which I'll talk about. One more piece for those of you who didn't get too much neuroanatomy. The interior of the skull is not a smooth place. It has a number of bony ridges that are terrific evolutionarily at stabilizing our brain. But when your brain does get bounced around inside your skull or rotates, these bony ridges can, well, as you can guess, they can be problematic for contusion and bruising. So in traumatic brain injury, the frontal lobes are the most vulnerable. And there's a phenomena called coup and counter-coup. Because our eyes are in the front of our head, most of the time that we would have a traumatic brain injury, it's a result of us moving forward, either inside a box, a car, or downhill skiing, or skateboarding, or biking, or running, or water skiing, all those different pieces. We are typically moving forward, and our frontal lobes are therefore more vulnerable. But remember, again, because our brain floats, it can bounce and impact the front of the skull and bounce back, and there can be a secondary bruising and problematic area in the back of the brain. So this slide I bring up because one of my 10-year-old likes making, when we let her, parfait desserts. She likes layering things. She layers Jell-O and whipped cream and fruit and pudding and many kinds of things, and she just loves that creative force. A few months ago, she was making one of these, and I was holding it in my hands, kind of admiring it, and I thought, this is kind of a good representation of the brain, in that the brain is not, even though I had the slide up for Jell-O, it's not all Jell-O of one consistency. The brain has different densities for different substructures and organs, and so if you think about the neurons in the brain, the long fibers that are transmitting information, the key cells in the brain, they cross across these different densities. And if you can just imagine for a second taking your hands on both sides of this glass container and then rotating it rapidly, say to the left, 90 degrees, you can imagine what you'll have. And that's what I had after I did that. And my 10-year-old started crying because I was a bad idea. I know she's a great subject for brain injury. I did explain to her that I was doing a brain injury experiment. She was not impressed. But you can imagine that these fibers, these red lines, which represents the neurons, would be bent and stretched. And that's actually what happens for something called diffuse axonal injury. And it's a component of some, not all, but much traumatic brain injury, mild brain injury, concussion that is, again, not visible currently on most or commonly accessible imaging, CT scans, MRIs. But it's when those different densities stretch the neurons and they have twists and tears, and the result can be permanent death of the brain cell. Now, we can recover, as most kids do, from that, but this puts the brain at great risk if there's a second injury on top of a first one that hasn't healed. And that's one of the reasons that concussion is getting so much more attention, because having a second brain injury on top of the first can be catastrophic and can result in second impact syndrome, which can result in catastrophic disability or death. In the continuum on brain injury, the severity is often referred to as mild, moderate, and severe. We're talking today about mild brain injury, which is a brief or no loss of consciousness, and that's the classic presentation of a concussion. But there are a whole range of additional factors that are related to outcome. First of all, let's be clear, a mild injury doesn't always result in a mild outcome, and a severe brain injury doesn't always result in a severe outcome. In general, they do, but I think we've all heard stories of somebody who's had a pretty remarkable recovery from a period of loss of consciousness or a very severe car crash. And we certainly in the Brain Injury Alliance know people who walk out their front stoop after a bit of a snowfall or ice and slip and fall on their backsides, have a mild shock wave go up their brains, and have some long-term significant outcomes. So the outcome related to concussion or other brain injury has also components of how old a person is, what their genetic predisposition to injury and recovery, what was their health status, what was the cause of the injury, where in the brain the injury was located, were there other components of injury to the body when it happened, how quickly did they get diagnosed, and was there any treatment given to stabilize them? With mild brain injury, there's not that much treatment or concussion except to make sure you're protecting from a secondary injury. Was there any rehabilitation? What were the family's resources? What was the knowledge of the adults around them? So another part of that complex landscape that we can look at is that the outcome for somebody from concussion or any other brain injury has a range of factors: age, genotype, the pre-injury environment. Again, as I talked about, what was the cause and the kind of the trauma? What was the age? How much cognitive and brain reserve did the kid or the adult have? Were there any other co-occurring conditions? Did they have mental health conditions? Might they have had diabetes? Are there other things going on? Those are the vulnerability components. And then what, did they get pulled out quickly enough? Did they get protected from a secondary concussion? Did they have some period of reduced cognitive stress, meaning did they take a break in many areas, which we'll talk about as well, which is standard of care now after concussion. This helps, I think, understand a couple of components about brain injury. We often say and hear in the field of neurorehabilitation that kids grow into their brain injuries. And if you've had children or you've been a child, probably better if you've had children or know children who've developed, you see that they start out as these beautiful, cute little food tubes that pretty much just, well, you know what that means. And then quite quickly, they develop personalities. Their brains go into a period of incredibly rapid development in the first few years. And this graph by Luria and also by Ron Savage is an attempt to represent the phases of rapid brain maturation. And the brain matures over the first 25 years in a number of different speeds. So if you had an injury, say at age 11, the next time you might really encounter some of the symptoms and challenges from that injury might not be until age 12, when your brain may not be pushing to the degree that it can because of that injury. So if you have an injury just before a period of what would otherwise be rapid expansion or maturation, it can slow this down. The other piece to remember is that the brain doesn't fully mature and it's been since 2003. We don't believe the brain matures in neuroscience until the early 20s, 24, 25 for most of us. And for some of us, at least my wife would say, some of our frontal lobes don't ever come online. So yeah, it's that same question you've heard yourself ask if you have a teenager or if you were a teenager when you did something. It's like, what were you thinking? Well, sometimes the answer is I wasn't thinking because I don't have a fully developed brain. That's what my kids pull on me now because they've heard this presentation in different ways. So let's get into the law. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of what's the same and what's changed. The old law, which was passed in 2011, was focused on return to play. It was focused on recognizing that anybody who saw signs, symptoms, or behaviors of brain injury had an obligation to remove a youth athlete from play in school settings and not to let them come back until a licensed healthcare provider had cleared them in writing. The new law, which goes online in July 1st in 2018, adds some components. But what is the same? The concept of having a licensed healthcare practitioner be responsible for the evaluation and clearance of an athlete back into play is the same. The information sheet required to go to students, parents, and guardians is the same. The requirement to remove from play and not recommence, again, until evaluation, sorry about that, let's go back to that slide, and not recommence until cleared by a licensed healthcare practitioner is the same. And as an aside, there's a new component for emergency medical personnel in the new law, but that doesn't include EMTs being able to evaluate or provide written clearance back into play. There's been a little confusion in some matches around this recently, so I just want to say that again. EMTs are absolutely empowered to call a foul, so to speak, on a youth athlete, saying, "Come out of the game. I want to check you out to see if you might have signs, symptoms, or behaviors of concussion." And an EMT, or anybody else for that matter, who's gone through the training, can recommend having a kid pulled out of play. But an EMT is not someone who has the training to evaluate and clear somebody back into play. One of the components that's not the law, however, is current. The current Iowa Department of Public Health and Department of Education return to play and return to learn protocols are known as REAP. The REAP protocol, which is available at iowaconcussion.org, that may or may not change by July 1st of 2019. There's a process that the Department of Public Health has been directed to go through to ensure that over time, going forward, the return to play protocols are in line with the evidence-based on concussion. This is Iowa's return to play protocol right now. Again, it's available for downloading at, at iowaconcussion.org, iowaconcussion.org. And the REAP manual is a process for guidance on how to and when to remove an athlete from play and a graduated return to play that is maximizing safety for back into play, but also a framework for how to remove and reduce the cognitive challenges that kids have in the classroom, with one fundamental caveat, which is frankly as strong as when in doubt, sit them out, is no return to play until fully able to be in the classroom, return to learn. So no RTP until RTL, no return to play until return to learn. So the REAP manual has some suggestions and guidance on how to adjust and accommodate for return to learn, and also how to pace for a student to maximize the speed of being able to return to learn, and therefore the speed of being able to safely return to the game. The graduated return to play framework came out of the 2012 International Consensus Statement on Concussion in Sports. The REAP is being updated for Iowa just in the next month to incorporate the new Berlin guidelines, which are very minor. They don't materially affect the graduated return to play framework, except for allowing for light aerobic exercise early on in the process, but definitely under the supervision of a licensed healthcare professional. So in our REAP guidelines, which are again at iowaconcussion.org, you can find this document. And let's talk about what's new or added. Now, first, the caveat. This is the opinion only of the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa. We followed the legislation very carefully throughout the session. We commented on it. We requested and had some changes. There were a number of organizations that we had to thank, including the Iowa Athletic Trainers Society for helping move this through, and others. Other interpretations of the law may well be valid. So I'm saying take this with a grain of salt, but we're doing our best to tell you what we think has changed. Administrative rules, as I mentioned before, are going to take place over the next 12 months. There will be some additional clarification of some of this legislation over time, and I'll just be clear that results may vary. following any one guidance and having yourself interpret it is the best we can do. There is no permanent protection from litigation, but this will reduce those odds. And frankly, that's a secondary concern for most of us. The primary concern is how can we keep our youth athletes as safe as possible. So 3 significant paragraphs added by the legislature in this new legislation. 1, the risk of catastrophic injuries or death is significant when a concussion or head injury is not properly evaluated and managed. They just come out and say it. Continuing to play with a concussion or symptoms of a concussion, a brain injury, leaves a young athlete especially vulnerable to greater injury and even death. And the General Assembly, the legislature, recognizes that despite having generally recognized return to play standards for concussions and head injuries, some affected youth in Iowa, some youth athletes are being prematurely returned to play, resulting in actual or potential physical injury or death to youth athletes in this state. So this issue of when should kids go back to play, the stakes are higher for licensed healthcare professionals on when to clear a youth athlete back into play. And that's what this law is focusing on. One of the significant pieces this law is focusing on. There's been some changes to the definition of extracurricular interscholastic activity, which is what sports does this law apply to? And what the legislature says in the law is that this means any dance or cheerleading activity or extracurricular interscholastic activity, contest, or practice governed by IHSAA and or the Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union that is a contact or limited contact activity as identified by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Well, what the heck are those? Well, those are available online or as an attachment at the iowaconcussion.org. And this is the most recent classification of sports based on the Academy of Pediatrics. These are medical conditions that they say affect sports participation. The contact sports and the limited contact sports are included in and covered by Iowa's concussion law, this new law, July 1st, 2018, with one addition, and that's dance. As you saw in the previous slide, the legislature had mentioned, I'll go back to it, they mentioned specifically dance or cheerleading in addition to the American Academy of Pediatrics contact or limited contact sports. So let's just be clear that dance comes over somewhere into contact or limited contact, so that's now included. Why? I can't tell you. I wasn't part of that conversation, but there it is. So what else is new? Removal from play. It was there before, but now dance or cheerleading are in, and again, not going back to play until cleared by a licensed healthcare professional. Keep going on what else is new here. So the Department of Public Health with the Iowa High School Athletic Association and Girls High School Athletic Union will over the next year review and develop or I guess ratify a return to play protocol pursuant to Chapter 17A of the Iowa Code, which is a rulemaking process, has public input for universal adoption by school districts in Iowa by July 1st, 2019. Now, does that mean that, we don't have to do return to play until July 1st, 2019? I don't think so. I had that question asked. I think it would be probably not the best practice. So again, the REAP is the current Department of Education and Department of Public Health and Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa endorsed protocol for return to play and return to learn right now. So the suggestion is let's use what we got until it may or may not change. Okay, what else is new or added? Schools with activities or contests in grades 7 through 12 shall adopt a return to learn plan as of July 1st of 2018. That's the middle of the summer. And for those of you who are school nurses or school administrators, I just have to tell you, this was the Brain Injury Alliance didn't put this in. The legislature put this in. It's not a lot of time. We totally understand that. Our goal is to help make this the least worst transition possible. The Return to Learn plan is to be based on guidance from the Brain Injury Association of America in cooperation with a student, parent, or guardian, as well as in cooperation with a licensed healthcare practitioner in order to accommodate return to classroom. And let's be clear, return to classroom has to happen successfully before return to play. No return to play until return to learn. That's the new state of science right now. So currently, Iowa Department of Public Health and the Department of Education have a return to learn protocol, which is REAP. Let's move to the next slide. I showed that before. There it is. REAP is a framework from a return to learn format or protocol, is a way to adjust and accommodate the typical symptoms, signs, and behaviors of concussion for kids in the classroom by reducing cognitive demands, workloads, by supporting taking breaks, by testing out recovery as symptoms improve. And to try to simplify this, which I shouldn't do, but the REAP manual goes into detail, as well as we have additional trainings on this, both on our YouTube channel and can give more based on request, is that we need kids to be able to do a little, rest a little, do a little, rest a little, increase doing a little, check and see if symptoms improve. If they get worse, back it down. If they get better, add stuff back in. So return to play is not advised until a student is 100% baseline, not only at school, but also at home. So cutting back on stimulus at home, hard to do with teens, testing out recovery, and slowly adding back in normal activities as symptoms improve. We're trying to keep kids from derailing academically, but we're also trying to recognize that concussion takes longer to recover from than we used to think. It's not just brush yourself off and get back in the game, or put back in the game after a couple of days of rest. This can take considerable time. Yep, there we go. I've talked about it ad nauseum, iowaconcussion.org. What else is new or added? A student athlete who has sustained a concussion may need informal or formal adjustments, accommodations, modifications of curriculum, and monitoring by medical or educational staff until the student is fully recovered. That's in the law. Yikes. That doesn't mean that we should deploy, and in fact, it absolutely is contraindicated to deploy 504 or IEPs for kids with concussions, because 80% of the concussions resolve right away. This is about putting a protocol in place that anticipates, there's a redundancy, that anticipates that kids are going to have concussions, and that considers what we're going to do in schools and in homes and with our licensed healthcare practitioners to recommend adjustments for kids in the classroom and at home to help them recover quickly, and how we're going to monitor them for recovery before they can go back into play. It doesn't, by the way, indicate or imply how the student was concussed. And what do I mean by that? It doesn't require this protocol, the return to learn protocol and the return to play protocol, don't require that a student be injured in an athletic event. The injury, the concussion, can happen from a skiing accident, a car crash, anything. If a licensed healthcare practitioner, if a school official, if a teacher realizes that a kid's had a likely concussion and has the signs, symptoms, or behaviors of a concussion, it should invoke, in the Brain Injury Alliance opinion, it should invoke this process for that student athlete. The concussion could be sports or non-sports related. So let's use an example that kind of points out what I think is one of the conundrums with this new law. Let's talk about Ashley and Jim, two hypothetical teenagers who've gotten their licenses recently in the parking lot of their high school, and I've made this up. I got this slide off the internet. I'm sorry if this is your slide, but they have a fender bender in the parking lot. And Ashley and Jim both have a concussion, mild concussions, fortunately, but both concussions. Let's just say that Ashley is out for girls soccer, and Jim, he's not an athlete at all. He's I don't know how he'll describe himself as a nerd, but he's not an athlete. So it's in the parking lot. EMTs are called. They diagnose both kids with mild concussions. School officials are aware of it. With Ashley, there should be communication to her coaches and her teachers because she's a youth athlete, and she should not be going back into soccer until it's clear that she's been able to come back up from to baseline where she was before this car crash. But for gym, this law says nothing. It's silent about gym. One of the considerations we have to have is whether we apply this equitably across all students for any form of mild brain injury or concussion, or is this only for youth athletes? And I think that's going to have to be unpacked over the next 6 to 8 months. But there you go. That's one of the conundrums. So what else is new? EMTs. As I mentioned before, the emergency medical care providers have been added in the law. And the sentence is, if a student's coach, contest official, or licensed healthcare provider, or an emergency medical care provider observes signs, symptoms, or behaviors of concussion during an athletic event or afterwards, they are to remove the student from play until they are cleared by a licensed healthcare provider to go back into play. Now the return to learn protocol kicks in as well, so that's just another component of what LHCPs, licensed healthcare professionals, need to consider, whether you're an athletic trainer, a school nurse, or a physician. So liability, there was a change to liability in this law in a couple of areas that limit liability to school districts and or to licensed healthcare providers or emergency medical care providers if they're the ones who are serving at the sidelines, either voluntarily, they have limited liability, or the school districts have limited liability, as long as, and let me just be clear, this language that I'm going to point out here was added back in by the Trial Lawyers Association in Iowa, which is the Iowa Association for Justice. They wanted to make sure that it wasn't just blanket limited liability, but that it had to be in line with a provider acting reasonably and in good faith and in the best interest of the student, and without undue influence of the school district or the coaches or somebody else yelling for the kid to get back into play. So it's not, how do I want to say this? It's not a free ticket. It's basically acknowledging that good faith has a component to it, as long as there's reasonable actions by licensed healthcare professionals or emergency medical technicians on the sidelines. So the implications, to kind of summarize, that there is now return to play and return to learn protocols required for student athletes, regardless of the cause of the concussion. It doesn't appear in this legislation that it need be a sports-related concussion. It could be a concussion the day before. It could be a concussion that somebody has on the playground while they were playing kickball or falling off the monkey bars. Perhaps it makes sense to use these protocols, not return to play obviously, but return to learn, for any concussion by any student. REAP is the current protocol. There are a tremendous number of partners that have bought in and supported this practice of return to play and return to learn. And they're included here. I'd like to point out and thank the Iowa Athletic Trainers Society, the Girls High School Athletic Union, the Iowa High School Athletic Association, as well as a huge number of other medical, disability-focused, and professional organizations across the state, school districts as well. So thank you for your support in getting this out. REAP at its core is a protocol for communication by the 4 groups of adults that typically surround our kids, and that includes their families, their healthcare team, their school physical and athletic team, and the teachers, the athletic team. It's not easy. It's not an easy process, but it's doable. A couple of things else to point out. We have a second annual Iowa Concussion Conference scheduled for July 26th at the Sheraton in West Des Moines. There'll be info you can find either concussion.org, iowaconcussion.org, or at our website, the Brain Injury Alliance, at BIAIA.org. BIAIA.org. So we will be rolling out more information about concussions at this conference. You're welcome to attend. We will have healthcare professionals, education professionals, and folks who've already implemented these protocols to talk about lessons learned, mistakes made, opportunities to kind of jumpstart or piggyback, or if you will, go to school on what other schools have done. More information can be found at iowaconcussion.org. There were questions that I've been asked over the last couple of months about this law, and so let me just pitch out a few answers to some of the frequently asked questions. Where do school nurses, they've asked this question, where do we find the time to be, if you will, in the driver's seat, given that we don't have the training to be able to monitor and or diagnose kids as ready to go back into play or be done with a return to learn protocol? So my answer to you is the guidelines that are available right now, endorsed by Department of Education and Department of Public Health, the REAP guidelines, are enough to be able to, with your clinical skills and your education, to be able to make those decisions. Might you not feel like they're enough? Absolutely. However, we're trying to put out, and we had been before this legislation, the best practices, the evidence-based practices, and those are included in the REAP protocols. So you can turn to those. This probably is a good time to have a conversation with school administrators about capacity. It also is a time to think about how to communicate, perhaps if those channels aren't open, with coaches and with teachers, either via intra-organizational email or other methods to try to track kids through. We'll do a webinar, and we'll also have at the Concussion Conference in July some examples of school district policies that have been developed in Colorado, which has adopted similar concussion guidelines, similar school policies that can kind of map out for a district who does what when. And that can change in different districts. There is no one recipe to get through this. Let's see, another question that came in had to do with athletic trainers. Are athletic trainers now required to be at the sidelines of all athletic events? And the answer to that is it would probably be a good idea. I mean, athletic trainers in Iowa are licensed healthcare practitioners. They have training in concussion recognition and response. They also have great training in any other kind of sports-related injury. But the answer is no, they're not required to be at every sporting event. And in fact, it's my belief that that's why the legislature included emergency medical personnel, because in many of our rural districts, they're the typical go-to first line of first aid and first aid diagnosis and trying to make that discernment or decision. Do we need to get a student athlete to emergency room care or to other health care? So certainly EMTs can make the call that they believe that there's a concussion that's occurred and remove a student from play, as can athletic trainers, as can coaches, as can parents. I mean, I think that it behooves us all. If we see on the fields a kid who's wandering over on the edge that the coach or school officials might not have seen, this is the time to go and say something. If you see something, say something. I think that might be TSA. I might be borrowing that from somebody else. In any event, those are a few of the questions. We invite questions to come to us. You can find our email links again at biaia.org or at iowaconcussion.org. Thank you for listening today, and I hope you find this helpful.